A very warm welcome from the Fabians Victorian branch on a very cold Melbourne night. So thanks very much for attending this seminar event. And welcome to our speaker, Professor John McKay, as well. This event addresses the topic of an industrial policy for Australia, economic and social priorities in a post-neoliberal and post-coronavirus era. My name's Sarah Howe. I'm a member of the Fabians executive, and I'll be a moderator for this evening's discussion, as well as also being in conversation with Professor McKay on this topic a little bit later. My background is that I've worked for 20 years in the labour movement, in both industrial and the political wing, and most recently I've completed a PhD on looking at the European Union's approach to industrial and regional policy. So hence that's why I'm going to be playing a role tonight in terms of directing some questions to Professor John McKay. Before we get underway, I'd just first like to begin proceedings with a welcome to country. So in the spirit of reconciliation, the Fabian Society acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. In terms of the structure of this meeting, we're going to firstly have John McKay on roughly for 45 minutes with me asking questions, taking us through to 8:20 p.m. At 8:20 p.m, we're going to move on to an online Q&A session and chat. We'll be, just to let you know, we'll be taking questions to our speakers via the Zoom chat function at the bottom of your screen. You can submit chats at any time, and we will attempt to pick out questioners who reflect the main themes that emerge. And then we'll be asking people to ask their own questions. I won't be asking them for you. I'll be directing you, asking you to unmute and ask your question at that point. At about 8:45 p.m, we're going to wrap up the discussion. And after the formal meeting, everyone's invited to the sort of more informal part of the evening, which is an online pub where we invite you to get a drink and some nibbles and join us in a robust discussion about the main themes that have emerged from the event. In terms of, I'll kick off with the formal part of the evening. Tonight, we're very fortunate to have with us Professor John McKay. John is an honorary professor in development studies at Deakin University. He's recently authored an outstanding comprehensive Fabian monograph on the topic for this evening. He was formerly Foundation Director of the Monash Asia Institute, Australian Apex Study Centre, both at Monash, and he has a special interest in the economic restructuring of Asia, the emerging security situation, and the economic and political cooperation in the region. So tonight, John's going to be discussing the structural problems in the Australian economy and labour market, which have been laid bare by the COVID-19 pandemic. He's calling in his monograph for bold and imaginative new industrial policy in Australia to usher in a new and more productive era for the economy and for society more broadly. He argues that the problems that have been evident in the economy for many years have led to greater trauma for Australians than if we'd entered the pandemic with a fairer economic system prior to going into that global health crisis. So Australia now has an opportunity, according to John, to rethink several formerly entrenched policy directions, and it's imperative that a new industrial policy be developed to guide the economy and the wider society into a new and more productive era. And he references Keynes a lot in his monograph in terms of tying in that whole notion of social progress is really dependent on the economic foundations, getting those settings right so that people have jobs that are important and highly skilled. So I'll now move into the more formal, that's the introduction over. I'm going to move into the formal part of the event. The format being that I'm going to ask some questions to John in conversation with him on the ideas emerging out of his monograph on this topic, and some discussion will ensue as we go along, hopefully. So without further ado, I'm going to direct my first question to you, John. The first question relates to your observations I'm referencing the monograph a lot here, your observations in the monograph on the impact of globalisation and the failure of industry policy that has, as you've argued, resulted in a dramatic hollowing out of the labour market associated with the demise of the manufacturing sector. You argue that the manufacturing sector had formerly contributed a significant percentage of national income, generated many upstream jobs, and also involved the creation of important skills and the capacity for technical and productivity upgrading in our economy. You argue that the end result of the decline of this sector has been the rise of low-skill, low-wage activities with a high incidence of casual employment, including large numbers of temporary visa holders. So I've got two related questions on that observation in your monograph. Firstly, how do you see in a post-COVID economy under a reformed industry policy, the manufacturing sector being revived to provide, again, decent paid jobs and restore the skilled middle of the labour market?
Gosh, the hard ones first.
Starting off hard.
Thank you everyone for being here. I've enjoyed very much writing this monograph. It's brought together for me a lot of the thoughts that I've been having over the years. And thanks to the Fabians for organising this event, and to Sarah in particular, who's I'm sure going to ask some very pointed and very difficult and interesting questions, and I hope I can do them justice. You mentioned globalization. Let's start with that. I think the general feeling now is that the heyday of massive, out of control globalization is coming to an end. I think there are some very good economic and political reasons why that is so. And I think in order to answer your question about where does industrial policy in Australia need to go from here, I think the first thing I need to do is, just, if you'll bear with me for just a minute, is to try to sketch out for you what I think is happening in the global economy and the global political economy as it relates to globalization, and the sort of pressures that I think this will bring to bear on the Australian economy and the Australian political system. Now, it's now commonplace to say that the world has entered a fourth industrial revolution. And one of our challenges, I think, is to understand, while it's still in its early phases, what that fourth industrial revolution looks like, what challenges it creates, and what opportunities there might be for us. The problem with this sort of analysis, though, is that we may be entering a fourth industrial revolution, but we've still got the remnants of the first, second, and third hanging around. And we're building one layer upon another, and much of the Australian economy is still probably the result of the first industrial revolution. So let's look briefly at what those industrial revolutions might look like, or what the earlier ones look like, and what the new one might look like, and what that might mean. And then perhaps I can try and answer the question, well, what does all of that mean for industrial policy? The first industrial revolution was, of course, the simple one, which began particularly in Britain at the end of the 18th century. It was based on steam power, it was based on cotton, steel, railways, and we had the emergence of the first industrial districts, the cotton zone of Lancashire, the woolen zone of Yorkshire, and the steel and knife district of Sheffield, and so on. That was the first industrial revolution. And of course, some bits of that are still with us. We still have, as we see in Asia these days, we still have ranks of young ladies usually with sewing machines doing cheap shirts. And that's very much the first industrial revolution, but it's still a large part of the global economy. The second industrial revolution began in the second half of the 19th century, and that was based on electric power, heavy and mechanical engineering, new forms of chemical reactions and so on. Soon we also had the arrival of oil and petroleum and the internal combustion engine. We saw, particularly in that era, economies of scale, mass production, and we saw the beginnings of the multinational corporations, which are still with us. And I think one of the interesting questions we're going to have to grapple with in our reformulation of industrial policy is, what are the multinational corporations of the future going to look like, and how important are they going to be? The third industrial revolution began in the last decade or so of the 20th century. It was based on electronics, computers, aerospace. There was some breaking up of mass markets. There was much more specialization, and individual consumers began to demand less mass production and more things that were tailored to their particular need. Okay, all of that's still with us, of course. But the fourth industrial revolution, I think, is the interesting one, and the one that we're particularly going to have to grapple with and see how it relates to the first three. Globalization was essentially the result of was allowed by new technologies in communications, transport, control, allowing factories to emerge in all parts of the world that could be linked together by these long distance supply chains and global production. That phase, it appears, is to some extent is still with us. But one of the things that the COVID crisis has brought home to us is how fragile some of those supply chains can be. And we are beginning to see some reformulation, I think, of these supply chains, which is interesting. Now, the fourth industrial revolution, usually called Industry 4.0, began, I suppose, in the 1980s, 1990s. The name 4.0 is an invention of the Germans, and it was first used, as far as I can tell, in about 2010. The fourth industrial revolution is based on biotech, nanotechnology, neurotechnology, green and renewables, ICT, mobile technology, 3D, artificial intelligence, robotics, sensoring, space technology, drones. It's a much more complicated story than those earlier, relatively simple industrial revolutions. And this, some people, I think, believe is leading to a complete new model in production and a complete rethink of how the global production system might work. Sorry, I'm taking a bit of time, but I hope I'll try and bring all of this together later. We're talking essentially now about what's usually called smart manufacturing. Use of digital technology, intelligent machinery in factories, flexibility in production, and what's generally called mass customized production. That is production on a large scale, but catering to the particular needs of individual consumers. And what we're seeing now is, for example, in 3D printing, you can produce things that are one-off. You can produce lots of different things, but you don't have to have a mass production in which you have 5 billion widgets all looking the same. You can have 3D printing that produces one thing for one particular customer for one particular purpose. And that is bringing a whole different thought to global production. We're seeing the integration of many of these machines. Another term for Industry 4.0 is, of course, the Internet of everything, or the Internet of machines, machines talking to each other. Mm. One of the things that this is meaning, I think, and this has enormous implications, is that the balance between capital and labor is changing. 4.0 industries are extraordinarily capital intensive, and they labor is specialized, not in large numbers, and I think all of that is important. Sorry, Sarah, did you want to break in?
I wanted to break in because I wanted to ask you, when I went to Europe, I observed that in the car industry, for instance, in the automotive sector, there's still, in Eastern Europe, there's still a divide between East and West in relation to an industrial sort of divide of production. So the kind of, you're saying the mass-produced stuff's all on the way out, 3D printing, customer-focused. I mean, that was all in Germany, sure, but it wasn't happening in Eastern Europe. So the supply chain, the global value supply chain, in terms of the routine producer type jobs, was still occurring in Eastern Europe as opposed to West. So do you see Australia becoming a bit of a branch plant, as you say? I think I'm going to bring question 3 in here and jump to that now. Do you see Australia, that being part of the problem, that we're being left behind in terms of the industry 4.0?
It is part of the problem, I think.
Yep.
And as I say, each industrial revolution is layered one on top of another. And one of the dangers is that you get left behind in the old industrial revolution when the rest of the world is moving along to something rather different. And the Germans are certainly moving along to something different, or the West Germans anyway. And the rest of the world is still doing, a lot of the rest of the world is still doing some of the old things. And the Germans, of course, are very worried about competition in this new field, particularly from China and from South Korea. And that's part of the story that we're going to have to deal with. Let me just, if you just bear with me for just one more minute, there are a couple of other important things about 4.0 that I think we have to take account of. One of them is what is called an ugly term, servitization. In the old days, there was a break between, a distinction between services and production. And you bought a product and you had that product. These days, the whole thing is melding one into another. If you're buying a product now, increasingly, if it's a German product, you're buying a set of services that go along with that product in order to get the most out of the product, to keep it running at all times, to upgrade it when there's a change of software, and so on. And what we're talking about in the German case is now not just producing things of themselves, but producing things that produce things. Increasingly, Germany is being talked about as the factory outfitter for the world. And I think that the Chinese and the South Koreans have got ambitions to do the same sort of thing, although they haven't got as far forward with it as the Germans have. Now, what are the demands, and what do I think industrial policy means? I think one of the things it means is that this is all extremely high tech, extremely high skill. And that's why the Germans are into it, because it's creating the jobs of the future, and it's creating the kinds of high-paying, high-skilled jobs that we all want for our economies. Now, the problem we have in Australia, I think, is probably at least twofold. One is that we've deindustrialized. And the removal of the car industry, I think we will look back on it in the future as being one of the great disasters of Australian economic policy. It's by itself, it wasn't the only thing, but what essentially we've seen is a de-skilling, a removal of technology, and as Sarah said in her introduction, what we're left with is casual jobs and things that don't produce much in the way of careers for people. We the first task that I think Australia will have to face in an industrial policy, and it does put us behind the rest of the world, is that we're going to have to try to recreate some of that lost capacity. And that will mean a lot of emphasis on education, skills training, technological training, and all of that. And I think that's going to be extremely costly in terms of government investment should be in education and skills. And I think one of the tasks that we're going to have in Australia is trying to develop a new model of economic development, which is going to get away from the old one. The old one, I think, was based on high rates of population growth, was based on providing simple consumer goods to a large number of people in the economy. I don't think that's going to work anymore. I think we're going to need a lot of money to invest in skills, to invest in trades,
Can I just break in there? It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation in that you've got the Morrison government saying we've got comparative advantage in space and defence, and we can make naval vessels cheaper than other countries and so forth. So they're putting 100 billion into ships and subs, which will only result in a couple of thousand jobs. But anyway, that's the sort of track we're on politically. And it seems to me it needs to have a bit of a political angle around what is the Labor Party. Do they need to come up with some picking winner strategies as well? And then we develop the education and training strategy based on that. Or is it the other way around?
Talking of politics, I think there are some political forces that are not. I've talked about economic forces. There are some very powerful political forces, I think, that are coming to bear on this new landscape that I'm trying to sketch in.
Yeah.
One is the backlash in much of the population against globalization that you mentioned earlier, and particularly global financialization. I think the global financial crisis of 2007-8 scared the pants off a lot of people, and we saw the beginnings, I think, of a backlash against globalization at that time. And that is being added to now by COVID, when we've had the breakdown of supply chains. We've had that has added to the global financial crisis effect. And then there's the question of populism, which is requiring a great deal of thought at the moment. So we have had a reaction against globalization as a result of various kinds of populist uprisings. Now, these vary from place to place. In the Trump case, we saw a reaction against what Trump labeled as unfair competition from China in the global economy. We're all familiar with that. The Trump version of a populist reaction to globalization. Something similar has happened in some parts of Europe, in Hungary and Poland and so on. We've had similar kinds of reactions. Brexit, you might argue, was a reaction against globalization in the global economy. All of those, I think, are sort of not exactly right wing, or some of them are, but they're more to the right and the center right of the political spectrum. What we're seeing in Latin America at the moment, which is very interesting, is that you're having a completely different populist reaction to globalization, which is coming from the left, and is a reaction against what they see as new forms of colonialism or neocolonialism, new forms of exploitation and imperialism. So we're seeing all of that political reaction against globalization, which I think is going to result in a lot of pressure on politicians to rethink globalization and all of those global policies that have been with us since the 1980s at least.
When I was over in America a couple of years ago, I talked to I often quote this example, but I just happened to meet someone who used to work in the automotive sector. And he said to me, that they loved Trump because he was out there advocating to get the automotive sector back to Australia, albeit America, albeit under a new guise. Do you think there's any capacity for us to take a more offensive strategy, for instance, in getting multinationals like Tesla to come to invest in electric vehicle production here? Or is that, as you say, given the different kinds of technology associated with this new form of production, that won't actually create a lot of jobs and therefore isn't a good strategy?
Well, you asked earlier, Sarah, I didn't really answer about this whole branch plant economy.
Yeah, I'm interested in that.
Is what you're heading towards, which is the idea that's been around for a long time, since the 1960s probably, that one of the problems in economies like Australia is that the vast majority of economic activity is not locally owned and controlled and developed, but is a branch plant of some multinational based in Europe or North America or somewhere, or Japan. And that one of the problems is that all the best jobs in the multinationals end up still at head office in Tokyo or New York. And what we're left with here is the branch plant. Now, there's been a lot of debate in the literature about what can be done about that. One approach is to, I guess we now associate it with Ireland, is to offer enough incentives to get multinational corporations to locate more and more of their activities in your particular jurisdiction. Now, in the Irish case, they've not quite managed to get head offices, but they've managed to get European head offices, for example, of Google. And that creates some at least middle level jobs and some higher level jobs. Now, the Irish are experts at this sort of thing. And I don't know how many of you caught up with the debate this week about trying to come to some global agreement on taxation levels for multinational corporations. The problem with the Irish solution is it's extraordinarily expensive in terms of offering incentives to multinational corporations. We're told that President Biden wanted to have the global minimum tax rate for multinational corporations at somewhere around 20–21%, somewhere around there. But the Irish in particular objected, and we've ended up with 15%, which is not going to do very much. It's better than nothing, I suppose. Now, I think my feeling about Australia is I'm not sure it's worth putting all those efforts into trying to attract the multinational corporations. It's going to be very expensive. You're not going to get much of a tax return. Well, we don't at the moment. Our tax returns from multinational corporations is very low indeed, and we are not really reaping the benefit of the multinational corporations.
I noticed in your monograph you do talk a bit about building our own manufacturing resilience.
Yeah, I think one feature of Industry 4.0 is I think it's a ground which is more fertile for locally controlled startup kinds of corporations or small businesses that can perhaps generate more locally than these massive multinational corporations. I don't think we're going to see the end of the multinational corporation in Australia, quite clearly not. And that they do provide some benefits if we manage it properly, and in particular if we manage the tax properly. But I think the way of the future is to think about more sovereign, local, national heroes, or whatever the South Koreans used to talk about, national ambassadors that were needed to push the local economy along. I think that's a more productive line for us.
And not just in the manufacturing sector?
No, of course not.
In other...
If we're talking about 4.0, we're talking about medical things, we're talking about biotechnology, all the kinds of things that Australia has to have some skill in developing. Okay, great.
I'm going to turn on to trade policy, because we have a lot of interest at the moment with Australia's relationship with the US and balancing the relationship between the US and China. So how do you think trade policy intersects with industry policy in the current context of that difficult balancing act, as you describe it as in your monograph? How do you think we can resolve?
Yeah.
Have you got any?
Well, I thought your first question was difficult enough. This is horrendous.
Yeah.
It's difficult to see a way through this at the moment. I'd make a few observations. The first is, I think we have to be a little bit careful about being out on a limb. We're not really big enough to be out on a limb, and I don't think we're big enough to make all that much difference. There's a lot of papers coming my way at the moment out of the United States, looking at how the United States might try to do a deal with the Chinese about organizing global governance of all kinds of things, how to deal with trade disputes, how to deal with issues like technology and patents and all of those kinds of things. I think there's a lot of movement in the background at the moment. Now, at the same time, while all of that has been going on, today I think it was the American House of Representatives, or was it the Congress, one or the other, passed a huge bill putting huge amounts of money into United States technology development, money into things like propping up American competitiveness in a whole range of areas. So we've got that going on, and the Americans are being pretty stern about all of that. When push comes to shove, I think the Chinese and the American economies are so interdependent that I think they all realize eventually that they're going to have to come to some kind of accommodation, whatever that might look like. And one of the things that worries me about Australia is that we're somehow going to be left out on a limb. We've seen some worrying signs as people have been standing on the sidelines saying we must help Australia. Isn't it terrible what's been happening to its barley trade? For example. But producers from Europe and North America have shown themselves extremely adept at coming in very quickly and offering to provide barley to China to make up for the Australian content. We saw that even under Donald Trump. We saw Chinese agreement to buy more beef, and that was largely a benefit to American farmers, and the ones that caught the slack on all of that were Australian farmers who sold less. So I think one of the things we're going to have to worry about is if this kind of big deal is going to be organized, where is it going to leave us? And the follow-up question is, of course, what can we do in terms of trade and trade policy and trade initiatives to try to guard against that kind of thing? And I'm not really sure of what the answer to that is. One thing I know is that we shouldn't be cutting down on our spending on the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade at just the moment when we need that kind of expertise, and we need to get out into the world. We need more of those people, but their budget's been shot to hell. There's a lot of discussion about middle power diplomacy, and I think this does offer some opportunities. There are a lot of powers in particularly the Asia Pacific region, Singapore, South Korea, that are very worried about what's happening at the moment. And South Korea is very tightly linked into the Chinese economy, as we are, and is worried about how they're going to be left out in terms of these sorts of big clashes between the old Asians saying that when elephants fight or even make love, the grass gets damaged and gets trampled on. I worry about that.
Right. You talk a bit about South Korea in your monograph in terms of its considerable success Did you want to elaborate any more on the developmental state model in terms of lessons for Australia?
It's pretty well known. Just a couple of things.
Yep.
I think one of the lessons for me from South Korea, and I've been going to Korea for since the 80s, is just to see how far they've come and how poor they were when they started. In the 1950s, in 1957, when Ghana became independent, Ghana had an average income many times that of South Korea. Now look at it. South Korea was behind the vast majority of African countries. So what I get from South Korea is several things. One is have some ambition. They started from way, way back. I'm worried about how far back we are at the moment, but we're nothing like South Korea was in the 1950s, and it didn't seem to stop them having ambitions which have been largely realized. The other lesson for me is just how important government intervention is and government pushing of the economy. Developmental states model that South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore adopted was very largely government-based and government-pushed. And it developed very strong private sector companies. I mean, in the South Korean case, we're all now familiar with LG and Samsung and Hyundai and all of those, Kia. They were all fostered, essentially built up by the South Korean government. So that's a lesson for me as well. And another lesson is that that level of government intervention in the South Korean Taiwanese economy has continued, even though they've got rich. This kind of structural change never ends. You start out building factories that make T-shirts, and then eventually you move up and move up and move up, and then you're building high-level computer activities in the way that Samsung is now. At every level, government has played a role. So there are lots of lessons, and I've written them in the monograph.
Yeah, that's terrific. And in terms of, you do talk about the need for a strong national vision in Australia, an overarching national vision for a new industry policy agenda that you point to in countries like Korea in terms of the developmental state, but also Europe. And in Europe, we're seeing a big push towards this notion of a Green New Deal, trying to get national consensus behind that in terms of, and you say, we need this kind of big vision, because at the moment, a half-hearted, patchy approach to reform policies will not achieve the goal. Could Ross Carno's book on energy policy that you reference on building a new economy built on renewable energy sources to become a new economic superpower be such a vision for Australia under the banner of an Australian Green New Deal?
Well, I think it could be. I talk about this at some length in the monograph.
Yes.
I think what Ross Garnaut is highlighting there is trying to say, well, we're faced with a very difficult situation. We're coming from way beyond, and we need to think of some things that can push us. One positive thing about Industry 4.0 is that people are now talking about countries being able to leapfrog. And if they are able to tap into a new kind of activity that gives them some advantage, that creates new kinds of jobs, that creates new kinds of technologies for the future, countries can move up quite quickly, and I think we should be trying to do that. And I think what Ross Garnaut has done is identified our advantages in terms of renewable energy, identified ways in which we might use cheap renewable energy to produce green steel, for example. We've spent all this time digging up bits of iron ore and sending them off to South Korea and Japan and China. And lots of coal, which is creating lots of carbon dioxide. If green steel technologies can be developed, and they can be developed locally, that might be a huge advantage, as well as Ross Garnaut also points out. At the moment, we're the Labour Party in particular is grappling with the problem of what to do about the old coal mining areas, what to do about maintaining jobs for people who used to work in coal mining, if coal mining disappears. As Ross Garnaut points out, the advantage of a lot of these green technologies like green hydrogen and green steel is that these will be tailor-made for the kinds of communities that are no longer going to have coal as their way of creating jobs. So yes, I think there will be certain activities that Australia has a particular advantage in, and I think Ross Garnaut has identified one of them. I'm sure there are others, and the medical area is one obvious example that we need to build on, but that's a huge story and goes beyond my expertise.
Yeah, okay. I think we're coming to the sort of the end of our time, so I'll quickly ask, did you want to make, I've got one more question, did you want me to, the one about regional development, shall I ask that?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, back onto regional development. I'm currently doing some work on a paper myself looking at the Whitlam government's Department of Urban and Regional Development to stimulate demand on the accelerated growth of regional growth centres such as Albury-Wodonga. You said in your paper that that institution, that key regional development institution, eventually died due to the dismissal of that government. What do you think could be a vision for new institutions cropping up in the current context, given the booming population problem, to revive, for instance, the work of the old Department of Urban and Regional Development or Cities Commission to tackle a more regional approach to planning?
Gosh, Sarah, we've had this discussion once.
Trying to resolve
a little bit before.
Yeah.
You always make me feel old because I was involved as a consultant with the Department of Urban and Regional Development all those years ago before the dismissal, and you see my grey hairs. I think well, first of all, the question of regional development I find interesting. In much of the discussion we've had tonight, I think we've been assuming that government means central government. And I'm not sure that's necessarily always the case. I think if we talk about 4.0 again, and we talk about the way in which visions of 4.0 might be put into practice, a lot of people, I think, are saying you need to know the activities, the history, the advantages, the skills of particular places. And that often the central government is not the place where you look for knowledge of such things. You look for it maybe at state government level or maybe even at local government level. And I think regional development often, I think, is probably better conducted not by a central government, but by something else. I don't know what, depends on what it is. In Europe, as you mentioned, regional development is a hot issue, but I think there's a bit of a divide between approaches in Europe on regional development. The old approach, which the Europeans used to talk about in their cohesion fund, now that's an interesting term in itself, because the argument in the European community was that if you're going to have a cohesive Europe, you can't have some regions that are way, way left behind, whereas other regions, particularly those in West Germany, are powering ahead. You have to have some kind of equalization. And so help has to be given to regions that are backward. And a lot of European industrial policy was about that sort of thing. And now you will see in the monograph quite a bit about that. What my old friend, Peter Lloyd, who was one of the world experts on European regional policy, gave me some very interesting advice. I hoped he could join us tonight. I don't know if he's out there. I hoped he could join us, but he may not be able to, from England. I think the balance, though, in Europe is changing. Instead of saying we're going to equalize and give money to the less well off, the emphasis now is saying we're going to back regions to be the best they can be, to increase their productivity, to increase their competitiveness. Now, so you're building on bringing regions up, not just transferring money in the hope that levels of living in different regions will be the same. Now, that I think is going to open up a whole new area. And in Australia, I think regional policy has been about several things. It's been about decentralization, trying to get population movements out of the capital cities, which COVID seems to be doing to some extent. It's been about trying to provide certain kinds of jobs for regions that have fallen on hard times, the Latrobe Valley, for example. I think if we start moving towards a more proactive, competitive kind of model in which we say, let's try to build on regional strengths and try to develop a new division of labour across the Australian space economy, we might end up with something that looks rather different. And I find the European approach now, where they're talking about things like flexible specialization, and I write about a bit about that in the monograph. I find flexible specialization a very interesting concept, and one that might allow regions within Australia to develop in completely new ways.
Yeah, I was at a talk the other day with the ambassador from Europe, the European Union ambassador to Australia, and he was saying the whole focus with smart specialisation and cohesion funds now being tied to establishment of a regional innovation system is working very well in practice. In East Germany, they're forcing the universities to, in a way, work strong, with SMEs to develop an entrepreneurial vision and so forth. So, but there is three.
I'm glad you've mentioned universities throughout. Well, I haven't talked about it tonight, but if you're talking about new skills, new technologies, the lessons from both East Asia and from Europe, that the universities are absolutely central, and part of our investment, I think, needs to go into universities, and we need to find new ways in which the universities can be linked into these kinds of productive systems.
Exactly, because at the moment they're working in isolation, and that's been the big lesson from the Gippsland case study. That's the state government here has invested heavily into trying. One of the big failures of it, in a way, is the fact that the university in Gippsland, Monash University Gippsland campus, is not focused on the productive assets of the region and how it can kind of value add in that way. All right, I think we might wind up our conversation, John. That was fantastic. A great chat. We're now going to move to questions. I'm going to go to Lionel. Is Lionel out there? No?
Yes, I am here. I think you are referring to me probably.
Yes. Did you just ask a question about renewable green energy?
Yes. Now, I was referring to the oil crisis in the 1980s, sort of when the Australian car manufacturing industry was hit very badly because just the small car manufacturing came out of, say, Korea, Japan, and those countries. They emphasized on small cars, whereas Australia emphasized on heavy vehicles, and they relied on that preference, and that damaged the exports market. Now, I think a similar position we are in now, because we are not taking the leadership in renewable energy, sort of, and we could have easily done it, but now we are lagging behind. And in that sense, are we getting back to a position like what we did in the 80s?
Yeah, I think I shake my head in horror about what I think is happening at the moment in the area of renewables and all of that sort of green stuff. I don't know how many of you caught up with today, all of those grants for carbon capture. I just don't understand why this government is trying to maintain what, in terms of those industrial revolutions I talked about, trying to maintain the second industrial revolution and pretend that it somehow will do for today. Those carbon capture technologies, I don't think have ever been shown to do anything very much. And even when they do, I don't think they're going to make a big difference to Australia. Or to try and hold on to coal the way we are, I think is madness. But we should be going all out into renewables and into areas that can. We're talking about rooftop solar. All that the Prime Minister is talking about, but it's about much more than that, I think. And the future of renewable energy will depend very largely on new technologies for batteries, and that, for example, and that is something that I think we should be working on as fast as we possibly can, and doing whatever we can to help with battery technology. And then there's things like the rare earth minerals, which Australia does have some particular advantage in rare earth minerals that are used in all kinds of industrial processes, and including the development of batteries. And we should be, I think, being much more strategic, having much more of a vision. Back to the South Koreans, they sat back and said, well, what kinds of industrial structure do we really need? What can we do? At that time, South Korea had never developed a shipbuilding industry, but they decided that was one of the ways of the future. They'd never built anything more than a rowboat, but they sent, Hyundai sent some engineers to Clydeside in Scotland, which still had a shipbuilding industry. They learned how to do it, and the first thing they produced was a 250,000 ton supertanker. I think we need some ambition, and I think we need some strategic vision, some ability to focus on what we think is going to be important. Now, it might not always work. This kind of viewpoint is often criticized as picking winners. I don't see anything wrong with picking winners. Everybody does that all the time. The thing to do is to pick good winners and things that are going to produce some results, and to push technologies into areas that we want them to go into. Technology has always been about labour saving. I think we need to rethink technology and say that technology often can be most useful as job creation, not labour saving. I think we need to make those kinds of strategic choices and back ourselves.
Thank you.
Great, thanks for that, Lionel. I might go with Julia. Julia, on the Morrison government and shareholder activism.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Yes, I've just been reading, because it's currently in the news, I've just been reading up on the proposed changes to the Superannuation Act, which are basically aimed at taking away shareholder activism, particularly in areas considered left-wing, like, following up decent supply chains and acting on climate change. Given the significant impact that so-called shareholder activism has had already on turning business around from its previous point of view on climate change, by giving investment advice, which has really very authentically warned that there was a potential threat to the future of the businesses unless they paid attention. Do you think if the Morrison government's successful and sort of lulls shareholders kind of back into their boxes, what do you think the hope for genuinely good employment conditions will be for Australia and any other form of investment as well?
Well, I think you've sort of answered your own question, I think, Julia. I agree with you entirely. I think this kind of shareholder activism is very important. I think democracy is very important in all kinds of ways, and to push industries to do things that are in the national interest, in the interest of the broader community, it seems to me to be a good thing, and the government shouldn't be attempting to stop that sort of thing. I think if we're going to have some kind of national vision, if we're going to have, and importantly with national vision, it's not just important to have the vision. You need to have the ability to get people behind the vision and to push and to do things and to be part of all of that. And coming back to South Korea again, none of South Korea's revolution would have worked if the population hadn't been behind it. And the more we can do, I think, to get the population behind these kinds of activities and let people feel that they're involved in creating the vision for the future and going out there and realizing it, the better. I agree with you entirely.
Well, perhaps people in this seminar can maybe hop into continuing with that kind of strange bedfellows relationship and write to the local members to back the shareholders. It'd be a kind of odd position for us, but
I think, Tim, you were asking the same question there. So what about, yep.
Sarah,
yep.
Sarah,
Max, yes.
Yep. We've always been wary about this notion of governments picking winners, but in this discussion, who should be picking the directions? Where should we, as a nation, rather than as an unfettered group of entrepreneurs, trying to determine the trends that are going to make the next generation of industries and skills requirements? Do we need God help us, should we have a commission for the future?
Well, I hope in this last bit of this event we can have some discussion between each other, not just asking me questions. I don't know quite how that could work, but let me just say a couple of things. One is in the monograph, I argue that in order to make decisions about the future, we're going to need specialist information about the future. And this is another role for the universities. I think we need people who are keeping an eye on what's happening in West Germany and in European policy and in what's coming out of Harvard and all of that. We need a lot of specialist up-to-date information. And then we need some group that can draw it all together and say, what does all of this mean? What seems to be happening? And what are the implications for a country like Australia? And I propose creating some kind of, I don't know if I tried to give it a name, but some kind of industrial policy. I keep using the word industry, but of course we're talking about much more than manufacturing industry. We're talking about the future of the country and the future of the economy and the way that goes into the social system and the political system. But let's stick with industrial policy. I talk about an industrial policy institution that could act as a clearinghouse, gathering information and presenting alternative visions for government to consider about future directions. What does all of this mean that's going on in the world? How can we take advantage of these new trends that appear? What is the best kind of thinking about the future of Australia? Now, I propose that we need something like that. I didn't call it a Cities Commission, but what I did say was that it should replace the Productivity Commission, which does seem to me to be too narrowly based, is very much a creature of neoliberalism and the whole notion of markets. And I would get rid of the Productivity Commission, replacing it with some kind of group that's along the lines that I've tried to describe. And I think there needs to be a big, wide debate about the future of this country, the future of its economy, the future of its political system. It's partly the discussion needs to be technical. It needs to be based on the best available advice and up-to-date knowledge on technology and all of that. But ultimately, I think we need a a very democratic, widely based discussion about the future and what it might look like. Because as I said earlier, it seems to me that we're not going to create any kind of future vision that's going to work unless everybody gets behind it. So I think we do need to pick winners, and I don't think we should be afraid of it. And sometimes it works. Most of the time, hopefully it works. Occasionally it doesn't. So the private sector is constantly making these kinds of decisions. Somehow we say if we're using taxpayers' money, we should not be bold enough to do such a thing. I think that's nonsense.
Terrific. Josephine, did you have a question about the caring economy? Are you still there? Josephine?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I am. Sorry, I was just finishing my pizza for lunch.
Oh, that's
because
okay.
I'm located in Malta, which, as you know, is part of the European Union. But most of my life I was in Australia, so I'm very interested in how Australia fits in the whole global, whatever you like. Yeah, my question though is about through all four of the industrial revolutions, people have continued to have babies and they've continued to get sick and they continue to die, and they continue to prepare meals, like I've just prepared my pizza for myself. So my question is what are the implications of this fourth revolution for the women in particular, who are the primary providers of the caring economy? You know, they're the primary birthers, they're the ones who give birth, they're the ones who take care of people, who provide the emotional support for all of these things that are happening around us, and that is essential for the fabric of social life to continue. So that's my question, I guess, and I think it's a difficult question for me anyway.
Oh, I think it is. I think this is one area in which, as I said, I hope we can have a general discussion. I'd love to hear what other people think about this, because this is not, this is, I claim no particular knowledge in this area.
Well, I think that's probably a good segue into the, because we're actually going to break up into groups after this event is over. So, Jeff, do we think, I think we moved to the online hub?
Yeah, I think this seems like the moment.
Yeah, I think we've reached the end of the questions as well. So I've just make some final. So what we do, John, is we break. The next step is we all get into groups and we can continue the discussion together collectively. So yep. Just finishing off some final comments. Well, I want to thank you very much, John, for a fantastic discussion tonight. I think you've covered a lot of ground, and it's got us thinking a lot about the questions that we now want to ask of you in the next phase. So that was absolutely fantastic. So thank you for that. And everyone, the monograph is on the Australian Fabians website, available there. So if you sort of get onto the website, you'll probably be able to purchase it for a very small cost. So yeah. Australian Fabians website, I don't know whether someone can put that up on the chat.
Already have, Sarah.
Excellent, thank you, Julia. The videos of the event will be on our website, of this event will be on our website and Facebook. We have a Max Jumay, we call them, Max Jumay event. We've got Max Jumay doing an event on the 7th of July, which is our next event that's looming, a facilitated discussion.
Sarah?
Yep.
I went off the air for about 4 minutes. Did anyone else have that problem tonight?
I had
to totally reboot the computer and start again.
There's been power blackouts across Melbourne. I had one just before I came on where I live.
Or it might have just overloaded. Who knows?
No. So, so we're going to have a facilitated discussion with Max Dumay. That's coming up to develop some policy ideas in a very collaborative fashion. We'll let you know. We haven't quite settled on the topic yet. And we have a couple of events coming up around, again, looking at the issue of China and Australia's relationship with China, and also China as an economic model, and an event coming up on the issue of workers' cooperatives in the Australian context. So we'll let you know about those, but I'd like to thank everybody for coming along tonight, and we urge anyone who's not a member to join the Fabians. Information on membership can be found on our website, and thanks again.